Here's an old Métis recipe, bullet soup. The word bullet refers to the tiny little meatballs. In French, they would have been called boulettes.
Growing up in Craik, Saskatchewan, Jo Ehman has always been fascinated by the origin of food.
It made me want to know how it was done. I knew my grandmother, but I knew her in an era of electricity and conveniences, and I wondered what was it like for my grandmother and her great-grandmother back in the days before we had any of those modern conveniences, even like a grocery store.
Ehman has been a writer for over 30 years and food columnist with the Star Phoenix for almost 10, and says she's come to recognize the prominence of food when it comes to shaping our province's history.
The Indigenous people who were here, just like us today, they had to feed their families 3 meals a day. They had to put food on the proverbial table. Before there were wheat fields, there were gardens. Before there was an oxen to pull the plow, there was a brood of hens laying eggs. The first priority was to feed your family, or no work could be done. So in order to tell the early days of Saskatchewan and how people survived here, how they prepared food is such an important part of that story.
Hoping to get a better idea of the role food has played over the past century, Ehman dug through old cookbooks, archives, and memoirs, compiling recipes for her latest book, Out of the Old Saskatchewan Kitchens.
This is a cookbook that tells the story of early Saskatchewan through the lens of food. So not the politicians and the big headlines and the big events of the day, but the people who lived here on the land. What food they were able to prepare for themselves, what was available to them. For those who came from other places, what recipes did they bring with them, and how did they feed their families here in Saskatchewan way back when? Those recipes are just as much a part of our history in Saskatchewan as the history books. Apples were considered a real luxury back then. Unlike all the fruit that we can get today, apples were one of the more expensive things in the grocery store. It's so easy for us nowadays to sit here and talk about the good old days. I tell you, it was hard times. It was a time of uncertainty, hunger. People often didn't know where their next meal was coming from, or they were scraping things together. The thing that surprised me the most from this book was just the tenacity and the ingenuity of the people who lived back then in finding food and growing gardens and making things stretch and not wasting a single thing.
With historical information, recipes, and black and white photos of the good old days, including personal childhood snapshots of Ehman on her family farm, the author guarantees the book has a little something for everyone.
The opening section of my cookbook is the history of Saskatchewan through food, from the fur trade, through the Métis, through the settlers arriving here. And then I go into the recipe sections, and it's much like other cookbooks where you've got your vegetables and your desserts and your meats, and every recipe comes with a little bit of a story or an explanation as well.
To find more information about Jo Ehman and her published works, make sure to visit ajehman.ca.
Cooking these recipes and discovering new things was just a real labor of love in the kitchen for me. And if you just
for Jo Saskatoon, I'm Janella Hamilton.
For Christmas baking, you would have just been able to buy as much as you needed, and they would have weighed everything.